So today we're going to be talking about licensing management in BarTender. So we're going to cover a little bit about the licensing model in BarTender for those not familiar with just how that works, how we handle specifically printer-based licensing. Then we're going to move into actually how to activate BarTender and kind of everything that goes along with that. So things are scenarios like activating, deactivating, moving a license. Then we'll move into monitoring your BarTender license, which is going to be extremely important as you manage it. So things like how many printers are you using, who's using printers, what printers are being licensed, etc. Alerts, extremely important part of your BarTender configuration. So you want to, in certain situations, I would suggest whenever possible to configure those alerts. We'll learn why those are important, what kind of alerts you can set up, and where to set them up. Then we'll move into user access. After you configure everything, we don't want just anyone going in, deactivating our BarTender license, or doing anything like that. So we'll cover that. Then we'll move into some more advanced topics, such as partitioning your license. So creating printer partitions, creating printer pools. Then lastly, we'll move into printer groups themselves. Now, if any of those terms don't make sense, today's goal is going to be to fix that. So we're going to be covering all those topics, answering those questions, and by the end of today's session, you'll be able to identify what each one of those means. So we'll begin with our first part of today's webinar, the license model in BarTender. So as many of you may already know, BarTender is printer-based. So what that means is that you can have unlimited BarTender Designer client installs within your network, and then you're licensed by the number of printers that you use. What actually counts as a printer is any given physical printer. For example, if 10 people are sharing a single printer in your office, that counts as a single seat or a single license account for your license. If somebody is using a PDF printer, an electronic printer, that's going to count as a seat as well. Now, BarTender now does have a built-in PDF printer, so if you'd like, you can go ahead and use that. And we suggest using it. It's out of the box. We know it works, and it has a few powerful options to it. But you are free to use your own electronic printer if you already have it set it up, or if you have a preference of any sort. Now, for the physical printers, there's not going to be a limitation as far as how many copies or how many labels, etc. you print to that given printer. It's going to be your standard. You print to that printer, and it stays licensed or it holds a seat for 7 days, and then it falls off after 7 days of inactivity. For electronic printers, it does work a little different. So pretty much what ends up happening is for every 2,000 copies that you use for your PDF printer, that's going to count as a seat. Most of us won't get to that point, but for those that do have a large electronic printer scenario, if you will, that's going to be useful information to know once you see the printer start stacking up in the admin console, which we'll cover here in a moment as well. Once you see those printers stacking up, and that's going to be the reason why. So we have the printer-based licensing, and then it's also by edition. We see the 4 editions available in BarTender. A good example would be, so you have an Enterprise 50 printer license. As always, with every edition, you can install on as many PCs as you'd like the BarTender Designer, and then you're limited to the number of printers, which we just covered. What's that exactly mean? So printer-based licensing in BarTender, how is that handled in the background? What are the details that you need to know in regards to that? So what's going to end up happening is whenever you install BarTender, what's also going to be installed is the BarTender licensing service. So that license service is going to be installed with every instance that you install or that you configure. And then what you're going to do is you're going to designate a central licensing service. Each PKC, product key code, or each license, however you want to phrase that, will have its own designated central licensing service. Here's what's going to happen when you actually go to print. We're going to be at BarTender, or however we're printing. We're going to print. That instance of BarTender is going to communicate with its local license service. Then that service is going to go out on the network and try to locate and communicate with the other licensing services and try to locate the central one if it is not the designated central one itself. Then it will ask for permission as far as it'll check against your user access that you've configured. It'll check against the number of seats that you have available. And if all is well, it'll let the print job go through. The printer will be logged as a seat, and it'll stay there until it has not been used for 7 days. Once that occurs, you'll be able to see that in your administration console. And we're going to toss that word around a lot. We're going to see some demos and things like that shortly. Another thing as well is a single BarTender PC, or if you have just a designated standalone license service, can host more than one license. We'll see how those can be partitioned today. We'll see how those can be permissioned out to particular groups or departments, whatever your scenario calls for. And we'll learn a little bit more about that. Now, this is all talking about in an ideal situation where everything is working, the network is up, we don't have any issues or anything like that. Immediately, you might be asking, well, I have a flaky network, my internet connection or my VPN might not be the best. What happens in that scenario when I do have a bad day? So we do have in BarTender what's called a grace period. A grace period in BarTender is going to be how the software behaves when a license violation of some sort is encountered. So this is the behavior you can expect. There's two main scenarios that we can cover today, or that we're going to cover today. And these are the type of grace periods that we have available. So the first one is going to be the 72-hour grace period. So this is going to be when, let's say that I'm printing happily and then all of a sudden my network goes down for whatever reason. I then have 72 hours to keep printing without my central licensing service or connection to it before I actually start getting denied print jobs or anything like that. So you have that grace period, and we find, generally speaking, that if an internet connection or something like that or a network is down for more than that time, you generally have bigger issues, right, than just BarTender. So that 72-hour period usually is sufficient. The only caveat on that I would say to kind of FYI would be to remember that that grace period does count even, like let's say over the weekend or something like that. So you want to be sure that, you take that into account if you do encounter network issues or something Monday morning, if you will. And that's scenario one. Scenario two is going to be when we exceed our printer count. That's the second thing. So we're licensed by printers. So we have our enterprise 50 printer license. We're licensed by, so we're limited to those 50 printers, and we can't exceed that, right? Well, things happen in the real world, right? Let's say something horrible happens. All 50 of our printers just break. We get next day shipping, and we get 50 more printers in, and they're the newer model, they're a different model, they're a different brand. So now we have an issue because we now have 100 printers in licensed when we only have a 50 printer license. This is actually going to be okay because of this grace period. So here's what's going to happen. So as long as you don't use a printer, it's going to fall off after 7 days of inactivity. And then you have 30 days after that, meantime to fix this. So you have 30 days. Meantime, you can go up to double your printer count. Then after that's 30 days, anything over 50 is going to start getting denied. Printer groups is going to play a part in this as well, because we want to set a priority. We usually have some sort of our main printer, our shipping printer, whatever it is that just is business critical. We want to keep those going, and we'll be using printer groups and a few other options. We'll be able to give those higher priorities, so those are always pushed up in the licensing algorithm, if you will. So those are the two grace periods that kind of keep in mind when you're managing and working with your BarTender license. So now we have a little bit of an idea of the licensing model, printer-based licensing, and specifically how we handle that printer-based licensing, right, with our licensing service and all. Then we move into activation. So we're going to have to activate, regardless of the edition, we're going to have to activate our software. How is this done? How do we go about this, right? Where do we access this? Well, when you first install the software, you're going to be prompted before you can do anything with the BarTender licensing wizard. This is going to be where you do a lot of your deactivating, activating, that sort of thing. Pretty much everything but move the license, activation related, is going to be done with this wizard. So the way that it works is you'll see this dialog if you move your attention to the right there, that screenshot. So you're going to see this dialog here. This is the licensing wizard. And it's going to prompt you to either activate, deactivate the software based on your status. Here we're going to go in this screen, we're ready to activate. And it's going to prompt you for a 16-digit product key code, PKC. You may be familiar with those terms. Not the support number though. So this is the product key code that we're asking here for. And this is going to be a 16-digit alphanumeric code that we're going to enter. These product key codes are dynamic, so if your license status changes in the future, you add licenses, you renew your maintenance, you extend it, etc., you do keep the same key code as you move along. And the way that you access this wizard here is, well, for one, when you first install the software, as I mentioned, it's going to come up automatically. So you finish installing BarTender, this is going to be one of the first screens that you see. Secondly, or the second option is maybe you're already activated or something like that. You can access it from BarTender itself, BarTender Designer to be specific. And for that, we just click on Help and then BarTender Activation Wizard in the Designer. Otherwise, you'll want to go to your administration console. So that's going to be where you handle a lot of your administrative tasks, such as your integrations, your system database, and for today's webinar specifically, your licenses. So to access that, you can go to your Start menu, All Programs, BarTender, and then your Administration console. Those are the ways to access it. And now let's go ahead and go through a couple different situations that you'll encounter as you go through and use your software. Maybe move the license around or, do things like that. So the first one's going to be activating BarTender. So this is going to be, not always, but likely your first activation on the network. This is the first time that you've done this, the first time that you've used your key code that you have been issued. And this is also going to be, if it's the first time, going to be where you designate that central licensing service. So remember, we have to indicate that at some point, and this is going to be when. If this is going to be a off-network PC or anything like that, as it's commonly known as just a standalone PC, that is completely fine. In that scenario, what we'll do is we'll just designate the local service, licensing service, to be the central license service. Let's review a brief video on how this is done, and I'll walk you through it here. So on screen, you should see that I have the licensing wizard up at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go up and I'm either going to type in or I'm going to paste, whichever way I want to do it, my product key code. Here I enter a sample product key code. You'll notice that we also have some other options such as search for an existing license or search license on the network. We are going to cover those scenarios later or in the next few slides here. But for this one, this is our first one, so we're just trying to activate our license here. So I entered my sample product key code here. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. The FAQ, the activation FAQ, is going to come up if we want to click on that. At this point, I'm just going to click next. I'm going to connect to the licensing service, or server, excuse me. And, we're going to check the status of that key and all that stuff. And then we're going to see the screen here. So now we see the support number under the license, the edition, the printer, so all the information relevant to what we're trying to activate. And because in this example here, I was on a standalone, it designated the local service as the central license server. Now, one of the important things here that you might be quick to just hit next because, everything looks good and you want to get through this, is there is a checkbox here that says share this license with other computers on the network. So that is pretty important because we are going to have scenarios, especially with the bigger licenses, where we want to share, as I mentioned, we want to share our license with others. Perhaps there's a department of designers or a group of designers. They may not be printing, but they still need the designer installed. And for that, remember, they need to be activated. So based on your scenario, and if you want to share the license on the network or not, you'll want to check or uncheck that box. If you want to restrict it further, we are going to cover user access later in the webinar. But for now, this is an important checkbox that might be easily missed. So we should be able to now go ahead and hit next. And then we're going to get to our BarTender registration page. Now, this is going to be a critical part of setting up your license. In order to receive technical support, regardless of the method, so phone, email, or chat, you are going to have your license registered. There are other methods for registering it, but in general, we just suggest go ahead and do it here. If you've already done it, you can go ahead and hit next and continue through here. But if you haven't done so, it'll just help you and add more value to your license to go ahead and get registered. Also, there's some other scenarios as well. So for example, let's say this is a standalone PC. It dies and you lose your license, if you will. The easiest way to recover that is go back and check your emails, obviously, or however you received your PK or your product key code. But the other way is you can just contact us, and as long as you registered, we can pull that up to you if it's registered to your account. So that's how you activate BarTender, and it's really that simple. That's going to be a pretty close experience to what you see the first time you go in and you activate your BarTender 2019. And then we can go ahead and we can continue to the next scenario. And this is going to be where we see a little bit of a difference in the dialogue, the licensing dialogue, and then also just what we click in the options. So in this scenario, it's going to be, let's say that we already did step one. We designated a BarTender license service somewhere. It's already happy and printing out there wherever it's at. And we want to activate a second, third, fourth, etc. one. How do we do that? We're going to be prompted with kind of the same scenario. Perhaps we don't know our key code because it's just not available to us for whatever reason. So this is going to be that kind of scenario. So we're going to be activating from a network license. So let's go ahead and review that video now. So we're going to get this dialog here. So what we'd like to do, we're going to want to activate our BarTender license. And here what we see is that we are showing all the network licenses available to us. And what we'll want to do here is we'll want to make sure that we select the right license and all that, but we can also see information as far as where that license is hosted, so the server. Now, if you don't see your license here, that may be because of, some network configuration, that kind of thing. But another option that you can do as well is you can search for an existing license. So for example, that license is hosted off shipping PC1. We can go ahead and we can click on search for an existing license. We can type in that IP address or server name, and then we can try to find it that way as well. From there on, if you still can't see the license, it might be something a little bit more complicated, a little bit more in-depth and related to your specific network. But for that, we'll probably want to contact your IT department, and if not, our support. We selected our license. We hit next. We'll see that it's relatively quick, that we activated our BarTender license. And then we're shown this familiar page once again. Now, once again, this is, I can't stress it enough to all my customers, so it's critically important that you register your license. But if we've already done it at this point, because this is the second one, we can go ahead and continue on. If you have not and you missed it the first time, this is a great second chance opportunity, if you will, to go ahead and do that now. So we'll register if needed, we'll continue on, and we can hit finish. And then once that's done, this PC is then ready to move on and print. The other scenario is, let's say that we're trying to deactivate our BarTender designer. So for that scenario, we either might be moving to a different license. Let's say we move the PC from one department to another and we need to, it's no longer on the same network for whatever reason, or, it's just not needed on this PC anymore. We need to deactivate it, right? So for that, it's all pretty simple. And you'll notice that it's kind of a common trend here. We always revert back, if you will, to that licensing wizard. So in this demo, we're going to deactivate BarTender. So we clicked on help, and in BarTender Designer, we clicked on help in the active BarTender activation wizard, and we're presented with this dialog here. So we can either activate off of another license, or in this example, we're going to deactivate. Now we are going to have the ability to keep the key code activated on this key code, and we'll see that in our admin console as we move on through the admin section of things. Or we can just deactivate it and remove the product key code from this computer altogether. Depending on your scenario and specifically what you're trying to do with your license, you'll select the correct option. So once you've selected the correct option, you'll continue on and you'll deactivate your license. We're going to change to deactivate and remove the product key code from this computer, and we'll click next. We're going to double check that we have an internet connection, and as long as we do, we see that we've successfully deactivated our copy. And in this scenario, that key code is then ready to be activated elsewhere or be used in another network or whatever your scenario called for. And that would be how you deactivate your actual BarTender license or BarTender Designer, pending your scenario. We also might have a scenario, and this is where we start getting into the admin console, where we want to move a license. So let's say that we have accidentally, intentionally, whatever, installed the license or designated a PC to be the central license service, and we no longer need that. We want to move it from shipping to a central server, an actual server, or something like that. So in this example, we are going to have to open our admin console. So remember, start menu, all programs, BarTender, administration console. We're going to go to licensing on the left. We're going to select the license that we want to deactivate, and we're going to right click on the license that we want to deactivate. And if you look, you have all the license information here. So, just be careful in case you do have multiple licenses that you do intend to actually move the one that you have selected. As I said, we're going to right click and hit move license. Then we're going to have a license summary. So we're going to get another option here to actually review the information relevant to the license that we're modifying. So that's the summary up there. In the destination, this is going to be where we want to move this license to. So where is our new designated central license server going to live? The second option might be new to some of us. Is going to be what printer pool we want to add that to. By default, it's going to go to the printer pool 1 because that's the default printer that we create when we activate the license. More information on that coming. So this looks good for this example here. At this point, we can go ahead and hit next. And usually it just takes about a second or so, if not less, to move the license around. The licensing service is going to change from my PC here to that new server. And we see that in the server column towards the middle right of your screen there. But then we see the activation date there and all the other relevant information. So at this point, if we need to deactivate this PC or decommission it, or maybe it's just going to keep on going as a client through its life, it can keep on doing so. And that's how you move your license. So like I said, pretty much everything is going to be done through the licensing wizard. Activating, deactivating, and everything kind of related to that, but really minus the moving of the license. You can also activate, as you can see here, you can activate a new license here from your admin console. You can also add a new licensing server or licensing service here as well. So here you'll be able to see all the licenses on your network. And assuming that the license is shared out, you can always come in here and activate against a different network license if needed, assuming you have permission. And that's how the activation section or activating works in BarTender. And before we get into a little bit more of the complex scenarios and situations, we'll go ahead and we'll briefly stop here for a few questions. As I mentioned, I have my coworker as well, Jasper, went on the line, and we'll see what kind of questions we got out there. Jasper?
All right. So one person asked here, when grace period How many printers are you actually allowed to exceed?
Good question. So it's whatever your printer count is times 2. So you're allowed to go up to double your printer count for 30 days.
The next question we have here is, why do you want to share your product key code and license on your network versus not sharing it? Is
Mhm.
it used for redundancy purposes?
Well, the reason for that is you may or may not want others to activate against your license. So in most scenarios, you likely do. These are network licenses, if you will. So you want to be able to allow others to activate against your licensing service. If your scenario calls for the opposite of that, that's when you would disable it.
Can you still activate a license offline, basically without any internet access?
Yes, you can. And what's going to happen is the licensing wizard will detect that you don't, well, it'll still try to connect and it will detect that you don't have an internet connection, or even if you do have an internet connection, but maybe you have a firewall set up, etc. It'll prompt you with instructions on how to go about activating your license when you come across that, or if you do.
Can you install the professional edition on multiple computers?
Yes, you can. So you would be licensed by printers.
Someone wanted to go over the licensing for the PDF and electric document printing again and how that is licensed.
For any physical printer, it's pretty obvious, so if you can, you touch it, that physical printer, that printer is going to hold 1 seat in your license. For the electronic printers, you'll have up to 2,000 prints allowed, and then after that, it'll take up a second seat. So for example, let's say we print 6,000, we have 6,000 PDF jobs go out, so that would be 3 seats. So at this point, we have an understanding of the licensing model, how everything works as far as activation, moving your license. So now we're off in printing. Everything's working and we're happy, right? But we still want to know certain things every once in a while. Maybe we're just trying to monitor things. Maybe we're having licensing errors on the client side, whatever that may be. But there's certain things that you just want to know, right? Certain questions and flags that come up. So what license is activated? Is BarTender activated? How many printers are being used? Who are using these printers? Who's using BarTender? All this kind of information is extremely important when you discuss managing your license. So all that is going to be done in our BarTender administration console. To get there, it's going to be the easy way, and how I usually do it is if you click in BarTender Designer, if you click on Tools, you'll see the administration console option there. So Tools, Admin Console. The other way, if you don't have BarTender Designer open, is you go to your Start menu, All Programs, BarTender, and then your Administration Console. How do we check all this stuff that we're talking about, right? So we're in the Administration Console, and we're in licensing here. And this is going to look very familiar to where we were just at, but it deserves its own slide and to be discussed. So we're going to see all the current license that we're activated against, the other licenses that we have available to us. So under other licenses, as long as that's being shared out, and I have permission, I can right click and activate against those other licenses. And then also we're going to be able to see the other license servers here, and we'll see their status as well. So green, obviously here in this scenario means good, so it's up and running. Whereas under licensing, the yellow icon or the yellow dot there, we see that this one has a license violation of some sort. If we do want more information on that, we can go into the other settings that we're about to cover, or if you just want a quick 1 sentence explanation, if you will, you can just mouse over that icon and it'll tell you you've exceeded your printers or whatever is wrong with that particular license. Depending on what's going on, it may or may not be an issue. So we'll continue on. The other one is going to be your printer usage. So if you look on the left, I switched from licensing, and I'm still in the licensing category, but I'm in a subcategory called printer usage. So this is going to be where all my recently used printers or my licensed printers are going to show up. And it's going to have all the related information to that. So the username, where it was used from, what license it was used against, because we can host multiple licenses, remember, and then the time. This is really an extremely important section to be familiar with or to understand or to know where it's at, because when you do have print operators out there and they do start getting a printer denied message or something like that, you want to know where to go look for information on what's going on so then you can react appropriately. Administration console, licensing, printer usage. The next one is going to be, and you see I'm just moving down, I moved down to user activity now, and this is going to be all my user activity. The user, what's going on, what license they're using, and the edition and all that related information. Also, we have tabs across the top there as far as, like how you want to display this information, where it says in last 24 hours, last 7 days, etc. Once again, this is all in your administration console, your BarTender administration console. So an important piece of software to be familiar with as far as BarTender is concerned. So we'll move on to licensing alerts. We just talked about how to check what's going on with your license, right? If it's activated, if you've exceeded your printer count. But we don't expect anyone to really sit there and watch that all day. Check in on it every morning, that kind of thing. So this is where licensing alerts comes into play. As I mentioned, they're extremely important because you don't have to be there babysitting the admin console. And as soon as something happens, regardless of, what time of day or what day it is, maybe you've exceeded your license, you had a hardware change we detected, you've gone into grace period, all those messages and information is available to you as an alert, an email alert. So they're broken up into different categories, and as you can see on screen and from what I just mentioned, these are just some of the examples. There's actually a pretty long list on what's available to you and what you want to be alerted on. But the main ones I would say is probably going to be your licensing messages and your system messages. Whenever you have a license infraction, you want to know if somebody stopped your service. Maybe it's not specifically a person, maybe it's an antivirus, maybe it's another thing conflicting with the service. So you want to know what's going on. And the reason for that is, remember, we have our grace periods, but those grace periods are obviously finite. So we want to be able to react as soon as possible so that we can keep printing going. If you react quickly, the print operator won't notice anything, the integration won't notice anything, and everything will just keep on working, if you will. So that's the importance of licensing alerts. And it's not mandatory to set up your license to get printing or anything like that. But for, pretty much any scenario, I encourage customers to just go ahead and do so. It can't hurt to get this email when some things go wrong. How do we set this up, right? We are going to have a little video here. We're going to go back into our administration console. We're back in our licensing section, and the subcategory is going to be our alert setup. So if you notice, you'll see all your PCs here that hold your licenses, so all your BarTender licensing services here. And what we'll do is we'll expand the one that we want to set an alert for. We'll click on email setup. We'll click on enable. And then at this point, we're going to just enter all our information here that's relevant to you. So obviously you're going to use your own mail server, your own to and from, and all managers or whoever owns this or whoever should be notified of something of this nature can be added to this list. Now, if you're not sure what your mail server address is, there's a sample there obviously, but yours is going to be different. That's when you would refer to your IT department. That information is pretty easily accessible via them. Once that's configured or once this form is filled out, you can do a quick test, which you can see at the bottom right of this dialog here. And as long as you receive that test, that kind of confirms that everything is working as it should. And we can go ahead and close this out. And if anything were to happen in the future where something goes wrong, you'll be notified. And you don't have to be checking live, if you will, the administration console if that's just not needed. That's the alerts. And then next we get into some pretty advanced topics. We'll begin with partitioning your license. So first of all, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure whatever you're assuming is going to be pretty similar to what it actually is. So when you partition your license, or a license partition, is when you allocate a certain number of printers to a partition. So what can happen is, let's say I'm going to keep on using the 50 printer example just because I've been using that. So let's say I have my 50 printer license and I need to divide it amongst different groups or different departments or different facilities. We can go ahead and we can create multiple partitions and separate that out. So instead of purchasing two 25 printer licenses, having two PKCs and licenses to manage, etc., what you would do is you would activate your single 50 printer license, partition it out, and from there you can apply user access controls. You can apply them to printer pools, which is the next section, and that's going to let you dictate, who's allowed to use, this pool of printers. You're always going to have a single partition by default. So even if you don't use this functionality, don't be surprised or, something's wrong or somebody was in there kind of thing. When you go into your admin console and you see that you already have a single partition, and by default what we're going to do is, yes, we're going to create that single partition, but we're going to leave it unlocked and we're going to make it the partition is going to be the full size of your license by default. So my 50 printer enterprise license is going to be a 50 printer partition. Now let's go ahead and review how we would set that up. So we're back in our admin console. We're spending a lot of time here in our licensing section. We're going to go to our license setup. Here we're going to see all our licenses. So in this sample license here, we see where it's activated. We see the support number, the last or the extension of the product key code and all that. And then we have the license partitions. I have my default one of, well, in this example, I have 3 printers here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to expand the settings on this printer partition. And the reason that I'm going to go ahead and do that is I want to create a new partition, but this partition is holding all my licenses. Its allocated printer count is 3 if we see, and that's actually the maximum, it's a 3 printer license. So we need to take away, if you will, some printers from this partition so that we have some unallocated printers to give to another partition that we're about to create. And this all ties in with printer pools, and we'll see how all this comes together. So we'll continue on. I'm going to go ahead and select how many printers I want allocated to this partition if I want to change printer pools. So now we notice here where it says unallocated printer count, I have 1 available. This partition has 2 assigned to it. So that means that I can do whatever I need to do with just 1. And these numbers are all just for explanation reasons. As you scale up, it works in the same behavior, in the same way. We'll also notice that they're color coded. So you'll have this little graph here where it explains visually what is going on with your partitions. So I'm going to go and I'm going to click on create a new partition next here. I'll create a new partition. I can assign it to a printer pool if needed. I can give it whatever number of printers I want allocated to this particular partition. And at this point it is unlocked, but we're going to cover user access. And now we see that we have 2 partitions here. One has 2, one has 1, and we have the color coded, and I hope that's easy enough to see on screen. So it's like a pinkish and an orangish color. And we can kind of just at a quick glance see what's going on and how our license is divided up. So now that we've done that, we could go to the user access control, but we're going to cover all that in one bunch. So then we can go and create a printer pool if needed. And with the printer pools, the way that they work is you assign a partition or more to a given printer pool. Now, this doesn't need to all be from the same license, so we can have 2 50 printer licenses and we can assign them both to a given printer pool. And then just what will happen is as one partition is exhausted, it'll move on to the next. So this would be the way to combine, if you will, your licenses and have, the total sum of printers shared across, just for a single user there. So printer pools can also have user access controls assigned to them. So we can say, this department can use that pool, this department can use this pool, etc. And also, like our partitions, by default, we always have a single printer pool created. So we'll go ahead and we'll go back into our admin console. We're in the licensing setup area. We're in the printer pools tab. So we moved over from the licensing tab if you look towards the top. And we have our default printer pool there. And it's just by default, it's called printer pool number 1 as you see on screen. And then what's going to happen is we expand it. We can see the license partitions that are assigned to this printer pool. And if needed, we can add more partitions, regardless of the license, as I mentioned. So in the previous example, which this works off of, we created two partitions. And what we can do now is we can go ahead and we can create a new printer pool, and we can assign each one of those partitions to the printer pools. So we'll close that out. We'll hit create a new partition. We can give it a custom name and description if we'd like. I just left it on the default here. And where you see available license partitions, you see that I allocated one printer previously in the previous demo to that available partition that's not being used. And that's why we see one printer there. Whatever we did with that partition in that previous in the licenses tab is going to be what's reflected here. However many partitions you have, I should say have available, are going to be displayed here. I only have one, so that's why I only have one example, but theoretically it's just whatever you have in your environment. So if you have 10 and you need all 10 to be part of a single printer pool, we can go ahead and do so. Now remember that this is in regards to printer seats. It's not in regards to physical printers. We haven't restricted that yet. There's a way to do that, but we haven't restricted physical printers or specific printers, I should say, yet. So we've added that printer pool. We gave it a name. We gave it a description. We've selected from our available partitions. We can go ahead and hit OK. Now we'll see that the printer pool number 2 shows up. We see all our license information and all that. And if we go into license partitions, which is towards like the middle left of your screen here, you'll see that we should have one partition in there, and it's going to be assigned just a single printer. So it's still kind of wide open, if you will, but that's where user access comes up. But before we go into user access, I do want to go into printer groups. So we'll continue on to that. So to create a printer group, so this is going to be where we actually get to specific printers. So the partitioning of licenses that we've done thus far are just whatever printer I select is going to hold a seat, and I have so many seats allocated to me, my department, whatever. Now with printer groups, what we can do is we can create a group of specific printers, and we can get really specific. So we can get as specific as, like the port, the model, all the relevant information to a specific printer. And also, importantly, we can set a priority to each one of those groups. So remember when we talked about grace periods and infractions and all that, the business critical printers should probably be put into its own printer group and given a high priority. The non-business critical printers should probably be put into its own printer group and given medium or low, depending on the scenario. And you can kind of pick, build your own profile and see what works best for you. But this is where you would set all that up. And then also we have scenarios where customers, they have print operators, they accidentally print to that, office jet printer or that inkjet printer. And that's just not a printer that we want holding a seat. We don't want that to be a licensed printer, but they used it. What can we do now, right? Well, in this scenario here, we can block printers altogether. So if shipping, for example, has no business using the front office printer, we can deny that printer completely. So that'll prevent, or that's another form of preventing unauthorized or unwanted printers being used and holding a seat in your license. There's going to be a default set of groups that exist. As you can see, the default and the blocked. If you don't do anything, let's say you just leave everything as is out of the box, as you use printers, they'll be assigned to the default group. And they don't have priority over each other or anything like that. And then there's the block group, which you can go in there and you can add printers as needed. Let's see a little bit of an example on this. So what we're going to do is, once again, we're in our BarTender administration console. We're under licensing. We're under printer usage. we're going to switch from the activity to the permissions tab. There we see we can create a rule. So, if we want it to default to to a specific group or whatever it may be, whenever a printer is used, we can do that. And then we see our out-of-the-box default groups, so our default and our blocked. And we can see that we have priority of medium set here, and that's the printer that I previously used. Now, if I want to add a new group, what I'll do is click Add a New Group. I can give it the name and description that I want. I can set the priority that I need for this group. And then from there, I can go ahead and I can just start adding member printers. So type in exactly the printer that you need and all the relevant information. And once you type that information in, you can hit OK. And that's how you give priority from one physical printer or even electronic printer, if you will, from one to another. So this is where we would create our high priority business critical printers. We'll hit OK and we'll see the list build up as, per your scenario and what you need. We can give user controls or user access, as needed. So we've talked about setting up a lot of these different things, and we've talked about just in general, that we can limit the access to all these settings and to all these options. So that gets into user access. So there's going to be, and it's going to be the same dialog across wherever you click it. So this is going to be what your dialog looks like. So you select a user or group, and then you either allow, deny, or set from where you would like to allow or deny again a user to set printer pools, to set printer groups, to set license partitions, and to set server access. So let's go ahead and kind of discuss what each one is and where you find it. So the first one is server access. So this is going to be where you can limit who can activate your license, deactivate your license, etc. Kind of like the main setup that we first talked about. So that's going to be located in your admin console under licensing. And if you look at the arrow towards the bottom right hand corner of your screen, you're going to see that little pencil icon. You're going to see the same dialog pop up, and you can build a profile, if you will, that fits your scenario. And they're called rules, and you can add as many rules as you want. Next, continuing on the same user access topic, you're going to have printer pools. So from here, you can limit who can use seats from a printer pool, limit where they can utilize printer pools from. And then, just as a reminder, so this is for that seat. We're not talking about a specific printer. We're not talking about denying the office printer or something like that to a user. This is for seats. So for that, we're in our admin console, and you'll see this icon kind of like all over the place, well, in the 4 locations that I mentioned, the user access control. So if you click on that, you'll have the same profile come up, and you'll be able to set your rules as well. The next one is going to be the printer groups. So this is where we get specific. Who can use a specific printer, who cannot use a specific printer, and from where. So this kind of has nothing to do with the seats anymore, and now we're talking specific printers. And that's user access printer groups. And for this, we're going to go to our printer usage in the administration console, permissions, and then user access control. And we'll get the same dialog that we're getting in the other places. Now, the last one is going to be your user access to the license partitions. So this is going to be where you can limit what user or group has access to a given license, if you will. So here we're back in the same place that we were when we set up the partitions initially, and under license setup, licenses, and then user access controls. And with that, we'll move into our questions, and we'll try to work through the ones that we can. Jasper?
All right. So when a user actually purchases additional printer licenses, how is that updated in BarTender with the actual key code?
So we'll check every now and then. We'll phone home. If not, there is, in your administration console, under the specific license in question, to the right of it, there's a green refresh circle. It should be pretty familiar from, just a lot of other applications. And you'll just want to hit refresh on that. And you'll want to refresh that license. And that should do it for you.
and what the differences between the free edition and the other editions are?
So it's mainly going to be feature based. If you go to our website, there should be an edition comparison chart or a little explanation, if you will, on each one of the editions. And the main thing is going to be what features are available to you. They all share the same licensing model, but what you can do in them or not do in them is going to be dependent on the edition that you have. And and it varies from edition to edition. So pretty much what you want to do is you want to kind of identify your needs to the best of your understanding, work with our sales team or your reseller and explain your needs. And based on that, we can give you the appropriate recommendation on what edition you should have. The printer count, that's another thing, so a little bit of homework for you. You'll have to survey how many given printers are you going to use concurrently with your BarTender, not installed or anything like that or other applications, but with BarTender. And that's going to indicate your printer count. So based on those two things will determine if you're going to be on the free or if you're going to be on the enterprise, etc.
Can you activate multiple licenses on a single system?
Yes, you can. So what you'll do is you're always going to have a designated, primary license, if you will. But what will happen is it'll show up as your other licenses. And based on either the printer pool, if you want to automatically, based on the printer pool that you configure, you'll have access to multiple licenses. Or you'll have to go in there in the admin console and you can always right click and choose to activate against another license on your network, or even if it's local. And you can have, theoretically, there's not really a limit on the number of licenses that you can have. So if you set it up correctly, yes, you can have multiple licenses. Yes, you can share them out. And yes, you can group them almost, if you will.
Are you able to select printers from a list to add to the printer group instead of manually entering in the printer information?
For now, you do have to enter it manually, but we are working on that. That is coming. That's a very good observation.
What's the recommendation for upgrading from BarTender 20, like an older version of BarTender to the latest BarTender 2019? Can older versions of BarTender talk to the newer BarTender licensing service?
Things do change when you go from 2016 to 2019. So when you upgrade like that, you are going to have a provisional period where you can use your, upgraded product key code, or if you have maintenance, or, you can use your 2016 key code. But eventually you are going to want to get on 2019. So what I would suggest doing is continue using your 2016, activate elsewhere your 2019. You're going to have a provisional period that's going to vary. It'll display it to you. It'll tell you how many days you have for your provisional period. And then take that time to migrate over to 2019. Moving forward from there, everything will be backwards compatible and everything. But that would be the process. Now, as far as files go, it's going to depend on what edition, or excuse me, it's going to depend, oh, well, yes, edition, but more importantly, it's going to depend on the version that you're coming from. If you're coming from an older version and you have integrations and all that, you can import those files. All the BarTender documents, so the BTWs, are backwards compatible still, so you can still bring those files over and they should function as you expect them to in the new version. And you can still downsave BTWs. So if you have clients or, older versions in your network, you can always do a file save as. Now remember, there's a lot of new features and options and all that in the new designer. If you use any of the new features and you downsave, you'll be prompted, but those features will be stripped. So if you downsave to a 10.0 version 10.0 of BarTender, you'll be prompted that some features are going to be stripped. Do you want to continue? So you kind of have to be aware of that. But as long as you're aware of that, there's two sides of it. Files, everything is fine. Activation, use your provisional period.
How many times does that 30-day grace period apply when you exceed your printer license?
There's not really a theoretical limit, and to my knowledge, we're not even aware when you go into that grace period. What ends up happening is, as long as you fall back into your license, back to my 50 printer example, as long as you fall back into your 50 printer or less, you can use the grace period as many times as needed. What's going to happen is, if you exceed your printer count and then you get to day 30 and you still haven't gotten back within your license, then you start getting printers denied. But as soon as you get back within compliance, that timer resets, And let's say, today I fixed the issue, next week I'm out of my grace period. And then the day after that, I need another grace period. I can go back into grace period. So there's not really a limit on that one.
Can you actually merge and partition licenses of like different editions?
I believe you might know the answer to that one, Jasper. So if you know that answer, that'd be great if you can answer it.
Yeah, so the answer to that one is you cannot do that. It's specific to the edition.
Mm-hmm.
So another follow-up question about the PDF and electric document printing. So when you reach the 2,000 count of printed items, it uses a print license. After that 7-day period of not being used, does that license get removed?
Yes, that is correct. Aside from that 2,000 limit that we discussed, it behaves pretty much the same. So, once that license falls off, then your timer resets, and that seat is then available.
Does our native PDF printer count the licensing the same as like an external PDF printer driver if we were to use that?
Yes, we pretty much treat all electronic printing the same. The only thing that I say that we suggest that is it's built into the software. You don't have to worry about purchasing an additional license. I know other PDF drivers out there. I've seen where customers pay for those drivers, and we have options as far as like security, default locations, behavior on overwrite. So we have all those options available to us, all from the print dialog and BarTender. So it's just out of the box. It's easy. It's less hassle on your side. If you have a preference or something you already set up, that's completely fine, but we have that as an option. They are treated the same though.
Can you define a particular printer pool and what new printer will use that particular printer pool?
I'm not sure if I understand that correctly, but so remember that there's and hopefully this answers the question. Maybe they can follow up if I missed the mark here. Remember that there's a segregation, if you will, between seats, licensed seats, printer seats, and physical printers. So you might want to use a combination or a tandem of those two to limit what printers are available to a given group or user, then assign a given printer pool to them. So one's going to restrict the physical printer that they can use regardless of what their license status is, and the other is going to restrict what license they can use and how many seats.
Can you configure the particular port, TCP/IP port that the licensing server uses to communicate?
Yeah, so one thing to know is when we broadcast out, we're still using a similar connection to what we used to, but we're now using a little bit of a different technology. And yes, you can reset the port. Yes, you can set the port or change the port in the admin console, but we're not so delicate on the specific port anymore. So it sounds like a veteran BarTender user there. So if you're familiar with that, the port 5160 is going to be familiar to you, and that's going to be our designated port. We have IT open those ports if they're blocked or whatever. But what we'll do now is we'll automatically switch that port, without you knowing, and we'll, show you what port in the admin console we're using, and just try to communicate with our central licensing service and the other licensing service, and we'll communicate things like printer counts and who's using what and all that, and the status of the licenses. So it's a little bit more dynamic, much more flexible, but that can still be configured if you have a preference.
Can you set certain restrictions for particular users who can add a license or activate a license?
Yes, absolutely. So that's going to fall into the server access section that we discussed. So you can set a user or a group in the admin console under licensing, bottom, and then user access. And what you'll do is whoever you want to allow to do admin type things, as you will, such as deactivating, moving a license, etc., you'll want to make sure they're allowed to do it. And you want to take into account where they're going to be doing it from. So do they have to be logged into the central licensing server to do this, or can they do it from their, work PC off wherever they are? But that's where you would restrict that. I imagine in most scenarios for anything bigger than a few printer operation, you're going to want to restrict that because as you saw, the licensing wizard is extremely easy to use and it's easy to access. And print operators get curious and we don't want them deactivating licenses out there or doing that kind of stuff to our environment. So it would be a good idea to go to your admin console, go to the licensing section towards the bottom, user access, and build the profile that fits your environment and your scenario.
For configuring user access, where do like the particular users and groups come from?
That's right. That's a good question. I forgot to cover that. So you can't create users or anything like that, as we saw, anywhere in the administration console. What actually happens is we source Windows users and groups, and they can be local or domain, and we source them from Windows, and then we display them there. So if you have a scenario where you have certain groups, admins, print operators, label designers, etc., you'll want to create those groups in Windows or an Active Directory, whatever you got going on. And then you're going to reference that group and assign appropriate permissions to them in the admin console once that's done. You can have multiple rules, so you can have things like 6 different groups and 6 different variations of it in each one of the user access locations, but we do source those from Windows. With that, I'd like to just thank everyone for joining us today. As always, we look forward to working with you, helping you create, automate, and manage your print environment. Once again, my name is Manny Castro. My coworker's name is Jasper Wen. We thank you, and have a good rest of your day.